history. At the moment, I'm writing what is best described as contemporary fantasy, set in the English countryside using the myths and legends of England to look at a lot of the classic tropes and ideas that have developed for urban fantasy. Because if you start looking at those ideas with different mythologies, you get some very different ideas and flavours and adventures. Specifically, my main hit character protagonist is the son of a dryad. He is a human, he is mortal, but he can see the supernatural. Not that he can tell anyone, because I think he was nuts. So this means he has to balance his awareness of a greater dimension in life with the everyday practicalities of making a living as a carpenter. The first thing I'm going to read is from the second book, The Green Man's Foe, which it doesn't contain any spoilers for the first book and gives quite an interesting explanation of Daniel, that's his name, his relationship with the Green Man, one of the archetypal spirits of English woodland. And this is from the very start of the book. I was standing on neatly mown grass, looking at an imposing old house with a circular sweep of gravel driveway in front of it. 2 square towers with battlemented tops stood at either end of the building, framing the frontage of 5 pointed gables. 3 were set back, while 2 jutted forward, to give the rooms on all 3 floors deep bay windows. The golden stone mullions and diamond-leaded panes all looked to be in good repair, even in this twilight. Glancing up at the roof, I searched for signs of trouble. No immediate cause for concern. None of the mossy stone slates were missing as far as I could see. There was no hint of the ridgeline sagging, and the clusters of octagonal chimneys were standing solidly upright. I'm a carpenter and joiner. I've worked on enough projects for restoring old buildings that force of habit makes me check things like that, even in a dream. I knew I was dreaming because the Green Man was standing beside me. I could see him out of the corner of my eye, indistinct in the gathering gloom, and staring up at the house, just like me. I turned towards him, but in that instant, I found myself inside the house. I had no sense of moving, but I knew that's where I was, without any need for explanation. This was a dream, after all. I was standing at the foot of a medical bed with steel side rails and a panel of buttons for different functions. Such modern apparatus looked incongruous in this oak-panelled room with its ornate plasterwork ceiling. There was no sign of the Green Man, but an old man lay bald and skeletal beneath the drape of a cellular blanket, its corners tucked with hospital precision. His eyes were closed and his gaunt face was waxy against the white pillows at the raised head of the bed. It stood in the centre of the room. On one side of a high, broad fireplace behind it, a Japanese lacquer cabinet bore a trail of vials and syringes. On the other, a bookcase's shelves held rolls of cotton wool, a box of purple latex gloves, and a half-used packet of incontinence pads. Out beyond the half-open door, a soft voice spoke to someone I couldn't see. He is asking for you. If the Green Man had broken into my dreams to show me this sad scene, he must have had a reason. I looked for clues. Over by the window, I saw a battered mahogany sofa with balding olive velvet upholstery. A length of scarlet knitting was wrapped around the needles thrust into their ball of wool. I think so. The voice outside the door was regretful. I realised whoever was speaking was on the phone. Heavy brocade curtains and a tasselled helmet framed a luminous evening sky. Through the window, the closest trees were black against the dusky blue. There was nothing to help me there. The phone call ended and the opening door whispered across the worn carpet. The old man's eyes opened as a young blonde woman walked to the bedside. She was his nurse, that much was clear from her uniform tunic. Do you need anything? No, thank you. Since it was obvious neither of them could see me, I followed the old man's gaze, wondering what he was looking at so intently. It was a wren, perched on a hazel sprig in the plasterwork ceiling. Close by the bird, I saw a face formed out of oak foliage. The shadowed eyes were lit with the merest glimmer of emerald light. I looked back at the bed as the old man coughed. Do you think they understand? He demanded. I'm sure they do, the nurse assured him. I wasn't convinced, and it didn't look as if the old man was either. A crease deepened between his sparse brows. The house and the woods must be kept together. Phlegm rattled in his throat. The nurse raised his head with a gentle hand. They'll be here soon. She reached for a cup with an angled straw. They must understand. The old man struggled to swallow a sip of whatever was in the cup. He looked over towards 3 silver-framed black and white photographs of uniformed youths on the windowsill. Their corners were crossed with faded black ribbon. Thank God the boys have been spared the horrors that took my brothers. But make sure they read my notebooks. I will, the nurse said as she laid him gently down. The old man's eyes drifted back to the moulded twigs and leaves of the ceiling. Do you suppose they'll know me when we meet again? Let's hope so. As her patient's eyes closed, the nurse returned to the sofa and switched on a lamp standing on a low table. She picked up a knitting and her needles clacked placidly. I watched the shallow rise and fall of the old man's chest and wondered how much time he had left. I suppose something like this must be all in a day's work for the nurse, though it looked as if he'd lived out his full span and then some. This could hardly be called an untimely death. Nanny always knitted in the evenings. A faint smile tugged at his withered mouth, though his eyes were still closed. Socks, mostly. A tawny owl's clipped call echoed in the woods outside the window, sharp with the urgency of the hunt. The nurse was startled into an involuntary shiver that made me jump, even though I wasn't really there. She looked past the bed to the dark hollow of the cavernous fireplace. A brass clock stood silent on the shadowed mantel, its ornate hands motionless. I could have sworn I'd heard it ticking earlier. The old man's breath rattled in his chest. She went to him immediately. She bequeathed the house to me because I understood. I knew what she had done. His words shook with an echo of old anger. But I didn't know how to put it right. I should have tried harder, but now, just as I was hoping he'd say something to explain why I was here, his voice failed between entreaty and regret. The nurse slid her stethoscope under his well-worn pyjamas. His eyes opened at the touch of metal in his fleshless breastbone. What have you seen? Nothing, she broke off as he glared at her. What have you heard? Old houses make strange noises. She glanced up at the ceiling. I thought I heard footsteps once or twice. I even went upstairs to look. She managed a brittle laugh. There was just the usual dust and cobwebs. It must have been some trick of the wind in the chimneys. At dusk and dawn, his faded eyes fixed upon hers. What have you dreamed? She looked at the mantelpiece. Clocks. Chimes. It doesn't mean anything, though. My gran had a silver carriage clock. You're safe inside. The old man's voice was the nearest thread. The woods and the flowing waters are the boundaries. Tell the boys. Car tires crunched on the gravel outside the window. They're here. The nurse hurried out of the room. The lamp on the low table over by the window flickered, as though a moth got trapped between the bulb and the green silk shade. Out in the hallway, a heavy door opened, and men's voices echoed through the dark house, taut with distress. Far away in the woods, an owl's fluting call sounded. Another answered, more reflective. The old man's breathing grew harsher and hoarser. He drew a deep, rattling breath. Suddenly his eyes widened. He stared straight at me, just as if he could see me. His mouth opened as if he were about to say something. Too late. He had no time left to take another breath. I woke up, surrounded by peaceful silence. I was in my own bed with the morning sunlight and familiar birdsong filtering through the linen curtains. So that's how the Green Man's Foe starts. And Daniel has to find out what is wrong at the old house in the depths of the Cotswolds. And as he works out what's wrong and tries to work out what he can do to stop something very unpleasant happening, he finds he has allies, one of whom is a young woman called Finn, who comes from a family with her own links with the uncanny and the supernatural. And the next book, the new book, The Green Man's Silence, which is going to be published on the 2nd of September, takes place when Danny's invited to stay with Finn's family. He's invited by Finn's mum. And Danny's quite keen on Finn. He would very much like to get to know her very, very much better. Going to meet the parents is not something he's ever done before. He is very much a loner, on the basis that you can't really take people home to meet his own parents when one of them is an ageless tree spirit. So neither Dan nor Finn are quite certain why her mum, Helen, has invited Dan to stay. And this is just after Christmas. It's January, so it's cold. It's not exactly peak holiday season, which is quite fortunate for me because I set the book before the world went completely sideways this year. So this is Dan's first morning. So we're some way into the book, but this is when Dan wakes up. I woke up early. I always do after the first night in an unfamiliar place. I went along the landing as quietly as I could to the bathroom. Not gonna lie, I was tempted to try slipping into Finn's bedroom, but her door was closed and the black metal latch would rattle. I settled for showering as quickly and quietly as I could, got dressed, and went downstairs. As I filled the kettle, I noticed the cold tap was dribbling. I'd seen that last night when I did the washing up. I found the back door key on a hook and went out to the Land Rover. I don't keep all my tools in the back anymore. Now I have a proper workshop, but I still carry the essentials. A couple of hammers, screwdrivers, flathead and Phillips, along with some adjustable wrenches and a set of Allen keys. You never know what you might need. These were in an old toolbox my dad had given me years ago, and there were all sorts of odds and sods in the top tray. I sorted through screws, nails, fuses, wall plugs. I found it I had remembered right. There were a couple of tap washers. Better still, one was the size I needed. I found the stopcock under the sink. Shutting off the water, I got to work quickly before anyone needed the taps upstairs. I was just putting everything back together when I heard someone coming downstairs. I expected it to be Finn, but Helen appeared. All of a sudden, I felt awkward as I finished up and turned the water back on. I didn't want her to think I'd assumed she couldn't take care of things like that. Sorry, I should have asked. It's just I noticed the tap needed fixing. Helen gave me an unfathomable look. So you fixed it? Before you made yourself anything to drink, she observed as she walked over to find I'd filled the kettle and not switched it on. Tea or coffee? Tea, please. I put my tools away and stood the box against the wall beside the back door where no one could trip over it. Helen put a couple of tea bags into a pot and spooned coffee into a cafetiere. You like to fix things, you like to help. Those weren't questions, but I answered her anyway. If I can. She waited for the kettle to boil, looking thoughtful, not looking at me. She made the coffee and tea and brought them both over to the table. I took a seat as she fetched milk from the fridge and mugs from the dishwasher. She sat in the chair across the table and filled a mug for us both. Do you have hobs where you live? I didn't think she was talking about kitchen appliances, but I wasn't sure of much beyond that. By which you mean brownies, pixies, they have a lot of different names. Earth spirits, inclined to take a fancy to human hearts and homes. She took a sip of coffee. Around here, they call themselves hobs. I know what you mean, I said cautiously, but I've never met one. There's always been a few around here, and we've always been on good terms, but something's wrong. Helen looked up as the door stood at the stairs opened and Finn came in. It's the hobs, they're really not happy. I wanted to ask how she knew, but that didn't seem polite. What's the problem? Finn fetched a mug and poured herself some coffee. I've no idea, Helen said, exasperated. I've seen them in the garden a couple of times, but they won't come close enough to talk to, let alone ask. If I walk towards them, they vanish. I don't want to press any harder and end up on their wrong side. Finn nodded with ready agreement, and I wouldn't argue. I remembered enough folk tales that suggested that would be a bad idea. Now the sylphs have vanished. Air spirits, Helen explained, seeing I wasn't sure. Inclined to play silly games, but harmless enough. I haven't seen one since before Christmas, and they usually love the decorations and lights. They're quite sweet, really. Finn looked concerned. There's no reason you can think of. None. Helen looked at me. I wished I could work out what she wanted. Think they'll talk to me? She smiled and looked more like Finn than ever. I was wondering if the Green Man could shed any light on what's going on. We've never had anything to do with him. He's helped you out before now, hasn't he? I rubbed the back of my neck. It's more that he lets me know when there's a problem. He makes it clear he expects me to sort it out. He turns up when he wants to. I have no say in that. Have you ever tried to ask him something? Finn wanted to know. Not as such, not beyond just trying to get his attention. I'm not sure how I'd go about it. Not around here, so far from a woodland. I didn't want to sound unhelpful, but I didn't want to raise their hopes either. There's a green man on one of the pillars in St. Peter's, then looked at me expectant. So she'd remembered what I'd told her about glimpsing his presence in carvings at Blythehurst. I could show you, she persisted. Couldn't hurt. Can't promise anything, though. I couldn't see what else to say. Finn stood up. After breakfast, Helen said firmly. Dan, can I interest you in beans on toast with an egg? Absolutely. That much at least was simple. And they go on to find out what is going on with the Hobbs and the Sylphs, and life gets very complicated very quickly. So hopefully that is a bit of an introduction to the books I'm writing at the moment. The series starts with The Green Man's Heir, continues with The Green Man's Foe, and the new book, The Green Man's Silence, will be published on the 2nd of September, so not long to go now. Right, that is the readings that I had prepared. I believe there is supposed to be a facility for some sort of Q&A. I have no idea how that's supposed to work because I'm not particularly au fait with using Zoom. So, anyone understands how that's supposed to work? Go for it.
Okay, assuming you're finished.
Hello.